The birthplace of life-saving discoveries. The world's first woman aeronautical engineer. The first to use the poppy as a symbol of remembrance. Canada's first Nobel Peace Prize laureate. First Indigenous forensic pathologist. And first gay and lesbian student organization. The first Canadian-born Black doctor. And first Asian Canadian to earn a medical degree in Canada. Home to the pioneers of the electronic age and the age of AI. Taking risks and breaking new ground has defined us from the very beginning. From our starting place to our expansion east to Scarborough and west to Mississauga. To the diverse powerhouse of cutting-edge research, teaching, and innovation we are today. The U of T community has continuously asked, why not? And what if? Looking to the future, we will carry on this grand tradition. We will bring together top minds, inspire new generations to pursue their passions, and celebrate the brilliance and impact of our graduates around the world. In this time of recovery, rebuilding, and reconciliation, we'll continue to take on what might seem impossible today. And together, we will build a more equitable, sustainable, and prosperous tomorrow.
Welcome to our University of Toronto Where You Are series for alumni and friends, which brings some of the University of Toronto's most compelling thought leadership to you, wherever you are in the GTA, in Canada, or around the world. My name is Linda Dudek, and I'm the Executive Director of Advancement at the Rotman School of Management. Although this event is taking place virtually, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, while we're meeting virtually, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The U of T Where You Are lectures shares some of the cutting-edge thinking that emerges from university's top researchers, innovators, and teachers. We are fortunate to be able to attract leading faculty members, in part thanks to our global excellence and reputation and our location within one of the world's most diverse and dynamic city regions. As U of T alumni, you are central to the life and reputation of the University of Toronto. Many of our alumni are also contributing their unique skills and talents to the numerous programs, initiatives, and activities taking place across our three campuses. Alumni engagement is a key part of the Defy Gravity campaign. We've set a bold target of inspiring 225,000 alumni to contribute their time and talent to U of T 1 million times collectively. I'm thrilled to be introducing this evening's speaker. Sarah Kaplan is a distinguished professor, director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy, and a professor of strategic management at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. Her current research focuses on applying an innovation lens to social challenges such as gender inequality. She regularly advises corporations, governments, and agencies on policies related to gender equality, such as board diversity, care work, employment, pay equity, gender-based analysis, and other topics. Formerly a professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, where she remains a senior fellow, and an innovation specialist for nearly a decade at McKinsey & Company. She earned her PhD at MIT's Sloan School of Management. She has a BA with honors in political science from UCLA and an MA in distinction in international relations and International Economics from Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. Please welcome Sarah Kaplan.
Well, hello, everybody. I am super excited to be doing this event with the University of Toronto, Where You Are. The last time I did one of these was in February 2020, just at the end of the month, literally I think the last possible day we could have all gotten together. We had about 300 people in a room, and it was an extraordinary conversation over a period of a couple of hours. I'm so grateful that now, 2 years later, I'm able to come back and have another conversation with the U of T community and beyond to talk about some of the important lessons that we've learned over these last 2 years about what's been going on with COVID and how it relates to the impacts, the gendered impacts on our economy and on our society. And through this discussion, I am going to be sharing with you research and work that we've done here at the Institute for Gender in the Economy. Our acronym is GATE, and our goal is to open the gates to new conversations. And I hope that this conversation today will do that for you as well. So thank you again for inviting me. And let me just start by talking a little bit about what we've learned about the gendered impacts of COVID. So when we, of course, have to pay attention, first of all, to the health impacts and the terrible losses that people have experienced. And that has been tremendous. And that is often been experienced by people more marginalized in our society, people who have had essential work, which means they couldn't protect themselves by working from home and things like that. So that's an important kind of first dimension of the impact. And we saw for a time that that was disproportionately a gendered impact because of who was having to go out and do that care work and essential work. When we look more broadly at the nature of jobs, in the beginning of the pandemic, about 63% of pandemic job losses, and this is in the Canadian context, were experienced by women. And that was primarily because, first of all, women were working in many of the sectors that were immediately affected, such as caring, cleaning, catering, clerical work, and cashiering when stores closed, when hotels closed, when restaurants closed, and things like that. But the second reason that a lot of women were exited the workforce was, of course, because of our gendered notions of who does caring at home. And with schools closed and daycares closed, there was a lot of burden at home in terms of who was going to actually be taking care of children or of elders and things like that. And there was very much a lack of affordable and safe childcare. I should also note that in the very beginning of the pandemic, certainly for families with two parents, a man and a woman, that men were absorbing some of that care responsibility. And that lasted for about 2 or 3 months in the pandemic. But now we see that there's still a dramatically increased responsibilities for care at home. And those are being almost entirely absorbed by women with extra hours compared to prior to the pandemic, whereas men have gone back, for the most part in the Canadian context, to the amount of time that they were spending on care work at home prior to the pandemic, which is much dramatically lower than for women. In some countries, we've seen different outcomes. I just learned today in a conference I was attending that in Korea, for example, men's care responsibilities have remained more elevated than prior to the pandemic. But of course, that was from a relatively low base. We should also note that the impact of the she-cession, as some people are calling it, is predominantly affecting racialized people, migrant people, low-income workers. Those are the folks who are being most impacted by this recession. When we look at the job recovery, it's primarily, when we look at the numbers now 2 years later, we see that actually women's employment on average has recovered to the pre-pandemic levels. However, that is not the case for single mothers whose employment is still 40 to 50% lower than prior to the pandemic. It's not the case for women 55 and above, many of whom have exited the workforce either because they are helping care for their grandchildren or their elders, or just because the jobs haven't been available to them. And even though the numbers of jobs have recovered, what we don't know is the degree to which those jobs are the same quality jobs. Our suspicion is, and we don't have full research evidence on this yet, is that while women have gone back to being employed after the major drop at the beginning of the recession, that those jobs often they have taken maybe more part-time work. They have maybe stepped back from the career progression that they had been going on. They've taken a more flexible job. There's a whole bunch of ways that even if employment recovers, the quality of employment and the career trajectories may not recover. So the other thing, when people talk about employment, that's usually in a job paid by a boss, but there's also a major impact on women's entrepreneurship. Women entrepreneurs and self-employed women were much more likely to be affected by the pandemic because often they were in the more affected sectors. They were more likely to have to assume more care work at home. And while women's employment has recovered, women's entrepreneurship and self-employment has not recovered to the levels pre-pandemic. And a lot of the recovery programs that were put in place by governments that were providing funding that allowed businesses to stay afloat and keep paying payroll didn't actually apply to many self-employed women or entrepreneurs running smaller entrepreneurial ventures because they didn't qualify for those programs. So while government spending has done a lot to prop up many sectors of the economy, it has not done as much to prop up women's entrepreneurship specifically. There are also many ripple effects that are associated with the pandemic that we should think about as having social and economic impacts. So the first has been a major rise in domestic violence as people are all cooped up at home, it being less safe to leave the home, less availability for shelters for the predominantly women and non-binary people who are experiencing domestic violence. This has not only incredible mental, physical, and emotional impacts, but also has economic impacts as people are not able to remain employed. There's also a major rise in mental health stressors, and this is both for families at home. In particular, if you look at the results, women's mental health stresses went way up at the beginning of the pandemic and haven't fully recovered to prior levels and is a much higher level than men in general, but also stressors to caregivers, to essential workers, to healthcare workers, all of the people who are part of what we would call the caring economy. Many of them are experiencing dramatic increases in their level of stress, anxiety, and poor mental well-being. And also, many communities continue to face insecure housing, barriers to accessing the internet, lack of access to clean water, a lot of things that actually make it harder for them to both avoid getting infected by COVID or recovering less quickly or ending up spreading it. There's all sorts of ways that people who are in poor economic circumstances actually end up being in poor health circumstances as well. So these are some ripple effects of the pandemic that have both these social health and economic and job related impacts that are important to consider as we think about how we're then going to recover. So what has brought us to this point? Of course, many people have talked about the pandemic as a portal. People say it took a pandemic for the country to see what was already broken, and not just the Canadian context, but around the world. People, who in positions of power may not have understood how much care work is required to maintain families because it was invisible to them because it had been predominantly done by women. We began to see who really were our essential workers in our society, and they ended up not being the lawyers and the bankers, but instead much more the people who are delivering our groceries and, maintaining the health care systems and things like that. So it has historically been a system that consistently disadvantages women, low-wage people, migrant people, racialized people, and other marginalized communities. And so when, we think about now 2 years in, we have this window of opportunity to potentially make change in these systems. We have to take those kinds of considerations into account. Now, what we do at the Institute for Gender and the Economy, our motto is to use rigorous research to change the conversation on gender equality. And so we've really been focused on thinking about how can we mobilize what scholars know, scholars from the University of Toronto, as well as in other universities around the world. What do we know about these dynamics that I've just been laying out that might help us think about how we can recover, how we can use this as an opportunity to create a robust and resilient society that takes care of people, even those who have historically been on the margins. So this is very much a University of Toronto and a university research story. It's how we mobilize those ideas to actually bring about change. And so I can tell you a little bit about what we've been doing at the Institute to try to do that. So the first thing that we did, the moment that the pandemic hit, we realized that we were going to have to make sure that the recovery that happened was a fair and equitable recovery, not a recovery that was just focused the way a lot of economic recoveries are. They're focused on, well, let's invest more in roads and bridges because that'll, quote, create more jobs. But those are primarily jobs for men and don't consider all of the different ways that recovery needs to happen. So the first thing we did was we partnered with YWCA Canada. They have wonderful perspective on the ground from doing the work in the grassroots. We brought the academic research into that conversation and partnered with them to create a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada. It was the very first national feminist economic recovery plan ever produced in the world. It followed on the heels of the state of Hawaii, actually, in the United States, actually put one out prior to ours. And it therefore had a big impact both in the Canadian context, but also globally, because people were citing this as something that Canada was bringing to the world in terms of a new lens, a new way of thinking about how we could encourage recovery. And so this plan, the link you can see on the screen, go to feministrecovery.ca if you want to see the details. We had 8 principles that focused on looking at things intersectionally, paying attention to race, disability, indigeneity, and all the different things that intersect, addressing root causes of systemic racism, investing in good jobs, fighting the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence, bolstering small businesses, strengthening the infrastructure for recovery, and we're going to redefine infrastructure to include the caring economy infrastructure, and making sure diverse voices are in decisions. And what I want to tell you a little bit more about is specifically around this care work as essential work as one of the pillars of our recommendations, because this has ended up having a tremendous amount of impact in the Canadian context. So we really wanted to say that if we're going to have a recovery, it's going to have to be a caring recovery, a recovery based on the care economy. And we think of all the different caring activities that go on in the economy. It's really the future of the economy. And I wrote about this also for Corporate Knights in a cover story that was about how the care economy can revive. And that conversation actually was part of, there have been many years of advocacy for more affordable childcare, for example, in the Canadian context. But this report that we wrote was one of the key pillars used in convincing the leaders in Canada to make this investment in childcare. And for those of you who aren't aware, the federal government did announce a $30 billion plan to make sure that there was $10 a day affordable childcare in every province in Canada. This is in the process of being negotiated and implemented across the provinces, not always perfectly, not always achieving all of its goals, but it is a major step forward in making sure that childcare specifically is more affordable, and a way in which, by mobilizing research, we can have these conversations with policymakers, and that can lead to changes in policy that are going to create more equity in our society. So that's one example of a way that the research led to the kind of impact that we really want to have. But the second thing I wanted to talk about, that was sort of the policy side and ways that we can influence policy. And there's a lot of work that we've been doing to continue influencing policy. In fact, just over the past 2 weeks, the Institute for Gender and the Economy has been hosting a series of workshops on the care economy in the recovery. And we are now going to build a full research network that's going to mobilize researchers from around the globe to focus on the nature of the caring economy and how that relates not just to corporate policy and the government policy in the macroeconomy, but to corporate policy and to corporate practices. And so I wanted to say also a little bit about corporate practices and how they relate to the recovery from the pandemic. I think everyone knows that for those living in the corporate world, those of us who have the luxury of having the work from home during COVID, where we spend our lives on Zoom, just like you're spending your time right now on a watching a presentation online. I wish I could be with you in person for sure, but that is going to be changing the notion of how we think about work for sure. A lot of different aspects of work are going to change, and even essential workers, if most of us are now not going and getting our groceries but are having them delivered, it's going to shape how essential work is done, as well as how corporate white collar work is being done. And so we have to then think about what are the ways that corporate work is going to change. how are jobs going to change? And, there was a big conversation prior to the pandemic about the future of work. That whole conversation has been dramatically accelerated by the pandemic as we think about many companies are not even going to have people come back to work. We're going to just continue to work remotely. How is that going to change both how we work, but also social issues of social isolation? There's all sorts of different things that are tied up in these kinds of decisions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of work. And, I think the first is it's going to really be connected to diversity and inclusion. And we can be very worried about the impact that this new future of work is going to have on diversity and inclusion. For example, if we go partially back to work, but we give some people the option of working hybrid or working from home, if that becomes very gendered, if the people who go back to work are the men and the people who stay home are the women, this is going to lead to very difficult challenges in achieving certainly gender diversity in organizations as we end up having kind of this big gender division on who does what. So when we think about recovery, we need to move away from the historical conversations of the business case for diversity, because that's actually distracting us from thinking about how to achieve that social and economic justice that are important from a representation standpoint, even separate from, quote, whether it's good for business or not. Now, I completely believe that achieving gender diversity and other forms of diversity in organizations is going to be really phenomenal for business over the long run. But if we anchor the conversation constantly in, we need to make the business case first, we're never going to get to those creative ideas that could actually lead to transformational insights about how we can, do the new world of work in a way that works for everyone. And so I want to move away from a project, the business case for diversity is really entrenching the existing interests. It's saying we need to prove that we're better than somehow the status quo. But we've all known for many years that the status quo has not been good for everyone. And so this pandemic being a portal, a window of opportunity for us to make change, is a chance for us to throw away those old systems of trying to do diversity and inclusion and really think more creatively about how we can use this as an opportunity to redesign work in a way that works for everyone. And the other point that's closely related to that is, we call it Institute for Gender in the Economy, but we really think about it intersectionally, because gender is diverse and diversity is gendered. That is, we cannot talk about gender without talking about race, indigeneity, differences in ability, age, socioeconomic class, and the same case is we can't talk about any of those other things without talking about gender. These are intersecting, and any solution that we come up with has to use the creativity that comes from thinking about those intersections to come up with different solutions. And I'm hoping that this talk in some ways inspires you to think about, well, as you design these new ways of working, how are you going to design them to be more inclusive? How are you going to take advantage of the technology that we're using to develop more inclusivity? I talked to a student the other day, a woman who had been interning on Bay Street, and one summer she interned in person, and the next summer she had to intern over Zoom remotely. And she said the interning over Zoom actually worked better for her. Why? Because then when the trader on Bay Street was sharing their screen, everyone could see it on the Zoom, everyone could participate, and everyone could get the same level of mentoring. Whereas when they were down on Bay Street, people had to elbow in order to be able to get close to the trader who was giving the mentoring, and sometimes the women got excluded from that. So in some ways, the technology can really create better advantages for diversity, and in other ways, it could create these gender differences that I described before, for example, women working from home and men going into the office. So we need to be very thoughtful and careful as we design our new ways of working, that we understand the impacts by gender, by race, and other dimensions, so that we don't design something that ends up having really negative consequences. And finally, I want to say that this means we need to rethink hiring and promotions. We need to rethink work itself. We need to look at this in a very different way. If we're going to have a lot of remote work, maybe this opens up the possibility that we can hire a more diverse workforce, because we don't have to have them literally down the street from us. We could find people from all over. So there are real opportunities to think and frame what we do differently in terms of the internal organizational diversity and inclusion as we map out this new world of work. But I also wanted to point out that this is going to give us this big opportunity to rethink our product and service design as well, rethink our offerings out into society. And the way that we've been thinking about it at the Institute for Gender and the Economy is that the real project is not just diversity and inclusion inside our organization, but in how we do business, serve our customers, and address our stakeholders. And we're calling this gender analytics. What we're trying to say is you need to take that intersectional gender-based view and lay it on to how you design your products, how you design your services, so that you actually get products and services that serve the community. And so we've designed part of what we did over the pandemic also to reach as many people as possible. We couldn't do in-person training. So we developed a 5-course online series of courses in a specialization on Coursera called Gender Analytics, Gender Equity Through Inclusive Design. And that program was really meant to help us not only think about diversity and inclusion in the organization, but to think about how you analyze your products, services, and processes and policies to uncover all the hidden opportunities for innovation and improved effectiveness that can come from seeing through that lens. And discovering how gender identity, indigeneity, race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, et cetera, intersect to shape the risks that you run in terms of the nature of the products, the opportunities that you have. Think about all the women who are inheriting wealth and who are leaving their financial advisors because those financial advisors have never served them well. And gender analytics is part of an approach to redesigning how you serve customers like that so that you actually give them an offering that's interesting to them. Think about automobiles. Women are much more likely to get injured in car accidents because car safety devices have not really been designed with women's body types in mind. Think about the risks that you run when you are not thinking about things with a gender lens. And so part of what we've been trying to do is continue the conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion in society and in our organizations, but also transfer this to a conversation about how we do our businesses in ways, how can we use those insights to inspire us to new innovations and transformations, not only in how we work, but in what we sell and how we make our money. And for more information on that, you can go to genderanalytics.org and learn a little bit more about that training if you would be interested in pursuing that. It's a University of Toronto course on Coursera. And so I will just conclude because I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. I hope this has provoked some ideas and insights. I'm looking forward to chatting more about that. But I also encourage you to follow us on Twitter at Gender Economy, go to our LinkedIn, look at our website. We're getting more than 80,000 hits a month now with the resources that we have there, including on, for example, the gendered impacts of COVID. And we have a great explainer on that. So I encourage you to go to that website and see kind of the research that we're bringing out into society to try to help shape that conversation at the policy level, but also at the corporate level. And I hope that the ideas inspire you to make change and transformation as we emerge from this pandemic. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some time with you. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. And I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about what your questions are related to, anything to do with the care economy, anything to do with recovery, anything to do with the impact of COVID. So please make sure to put your questions in if you want to ask them. I do already have a question that's come in, which is how can employers help women who are impacted with the increased responsibilities, work, childcare, family duties during COVID? I think this is a really great question because these responsibilities are not going away. What we've learned now that we're already into the third year of the pandemic is that a lot of we haven't gone back to normal for sure. Many people who worked in offices are still working from home. Children are back in school, but school and daycare also has become much more uncertain. So there's so many more times where your kid's been exposed and they have to be sent home. And that level of uncertainty really, I think, is one of the fundamental challenges, is that uncertainty is what's making it even harder for families than it was prior to the pandemic. And so what can employers do to help, with this issue? and this is for women, but this is also for men, whoever is feeling the additional pressure to care for families, and also this could include elder care. I think what employers can do is take the lessons that they've learned from the pandemic about the fact that people can work from home. They can take a break to take care of their kids and pick up later. They can, be doing a work call from somewhere while they're dealing with a childcare issue. And so we know it's a lot more possible to be flexible than we thought before. Many organizations were unwilling to introduce flexible work because they thought people would be less productive. In fact, people are more productive with flexible work than they were when they were having to come into the office. And that's primarily because people save all the commuting time and maybe just focus a little bit more on their jobs. There are many losses that come with it, like, the water cooler conversations in the hall and things like that. And so companies have to invest in that. But I think primarily it's thinking about how can we make work flexibility work better for everyone? And that also could mean that you need to make sure that those policies are really attractive, not just to women, but to everyone in an organization. We know that if only women take advantage of flexible work, then it becomes gendered, then it becomes lower status, then it becomes a signal that you're not as committed to work. And so what we really want to do is make sure that those policies are equally appealing to everyone, and that leadership is reinforcing that it's absolutely okay to use flexible work policies, even as some organizations go back to the office. Now, many organizations aren't even going back to the office, so we're really going to have to rethink that. But I think it's about making, even before the pandemic, we were talking about making parental leave equally attractive to all parents, so that it's not just that women take parental leave, but men take parental leave as well, because that is going to give men the opportunity to experience caring for their children, which is a huge loss if you can't do that. And also it evens out who's taking advantage of those policies. So I think one thing that companies can do is really learn from the pandemic about flexible work and find policies that are equally appealing to everyone. And I think that relates to a second question that I've gotten. Now I've got many questions coming in the chat about, is gender equality a concern for men? And I think this is a really wonderful question, because yes, of course, gender equality means, we don't mean just for women. The word is not women equality, it's gender equality. Why? Because there's so many things that also, by achieving greater equity at home and equity at work, you actually get people living fuller lives. So men often have been pressured at work not to take parental leave, or to leave early to go to their kids' ball game or whatever it is. These are huge losses for men. And unfortunately, men are still in quite a straitjacket when it comes to masculinity. I like to joke that when I started working in 1986 after university, women could only wear skirt suits. And now I can wear a skirt suit or a pantsuit if I want to dress more formally. Of course, during COVID, you can wear sweatpants and no one would know. But men are still only wearing pantsuits. And it's just a metaphor for me. It's not really a serious idea, but just a metaphor for the fact that we've made more progress on opening up the possibilities for women than we've made in opening up the possibilities for men. And so that means that men are often not able to participate in family life in the way that they would like. It's also true that the constraints that we have on masculinity means that men who are maybe don't conform even to those masculine norms also feel a lot of pressure and can't, be themselves the way they want to be. This particularly affects racialized men and LGBTQ men. So when we say, is it gender equality benefiting men? I think sometimes our anchor point is just like the straight white man at the top of corporate Canada. And really men and masculinity should be able to be, manifested in many different ways. You have a richer work life, you have a richer home life, you have more creativity at work, more innovation, more, ability to develop products and services that meet the larger set of needs in our society. There's all sorts of ways that, gender equality is really benefiting everyone. And we did a podcast series called Busted, where we were busting various myths. And one episode of Busted as part of the Gate audio series. One episode of Busted is entirely on talking about all the ways that gender equality really is as much an issue for men as it is for women. So we have another question that says, when you speak about men returning to the workplace and women staying home, this does not include women who are essential workers in the workplace, such as office support staff, cleaners, etc. That work is gendered too. And yes, I absolutely agree. When we're talking about office work and the people who have the luxury of being able to work from home, that's where we see these gender division. But as I said right in the beginning of my talk, most of the people who, the majority of the people who were essential workers, that is providing the care work, providing the grocery delivery, and all of those kinds of things, were people from marginalized communities and often women from marginalized communities. And they were the ones who were actually physically putting their lives on the line in order for those of us who have the luxury of staying home, benefited from tremendously. So that is also gendered. So it's like, on the one hand, women disproportionately lost jobs. On the other hand, women were disproportionately in the most vulnerable, the most dangerous jobs that were out there. I can say that my sister is a nurse in an intensive care unit. She just spent the last 2 years caring for COVID patients. And so I know very personally the nature of the people who put their bodies on the line to help in society. So I think that's a wonderful point, and we don't want to forget all the different ways that, the people who are most disadvantaged by COVID are the people who are already marginalized in our society. We think about immigrant workers. Often were staffing long-term care homes. They were often getting very ill because they were paid so poorly. They often had to work in multiple care homes to put together enough income. They were therefore spreading COVID simply because they were trying to make ends meet in their household. We also know single head of household families are often women who had those households, and their job recovery, their jobs have not recovered. So we know there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are still out in their society, and I really appreciate that point. Okay, another question. The care economy jobs generally require less education and training. While they may seem essential, how can we reframe how we value jobs and determine compensation? So this is a wonderful question. And in fact, as I mentioned in my talk, we just held, with the support of the federal government through Women and Gender Equality Canada, we held a 4-day workshop of academics from around the world to talk exactly about this question. So I will tell you, first of all, there's a lot of open research questions, things that we at the Institute for Gender and the Economy are going to be really devoted to understanding, because we don't know all the answers. It is true that often care jobs don't necessarily require as much education as, say, we think that investment banking or being a lawyer or something like that does. However, when you look at the technical difficulty of those jobs, how hard those jobs are, they are often extremely difficult. Knowing how to take care of a room full of 3-year-olds, I can tell you, requires incredible amount of skill. The same thing with people who are taking care of the elderly. We have not historically in our society valued those jobs. Why? Because often they were done by women for free in families because it was unpaid care work. Therefore, when it becomes paid care work, we don't value it as much. In addition, the fact is that families need to be able to afford care. They need to be able to afford to pay for, whether it's daycare, whether it's school, whether it's long-term care, whether it's care for the elderly. And so there's been this pressure to keep wages down, so to keep it affordable. Now, there's another way to make these services affordable, and that's to pay more for them, or have the government, we as a polity could agree that this is such an important issue that we're willing to have more of our taxes taken for this kind of issue, so that we are actually supporting it to the point where it is affordable for families. Because if we don't do that, then we get a bifurcated system where the wealthy can afford what they want, and people of modest means or middle-class people or poor people cannot afford these services. So we as a society need to decide, and this federal government announcement of creating more affordable daycare and early childhood learning is an important decision that we've made as a society, that this is important for us, but we need to do more. And even on this point of education, I can tell you that if we are going to make good on this promise of affordable childcare, we need to educate hundreds of thousands more early childhood educators. We do not have enough early childhood educators. And even the ones who've been educated often don't do those jobs because they're not well paid enough, but there's still education involved. And so we need to invest massively in more education for early childhood educators. And also, as this question implies, better pay for those workers. Absolutely. Okay. So many questions have come in. I'm just going to keep powering through them. I'm just so delighted to see how much engagement there is from everyone. So another question is, how do we promote and invite middle-aged professionals to join the workforce and diminish age discrimination? So it is true there is age discrimination. There's so many awards and things like that for top 35 under 35 and things like that. You know, we tend not to value older workers. And maybe we're seeing this a little bit in the fact that the jobs have not, when we talk about jobs recovery, men over the age of 65, their jobs have not recovered to the level they were before, and women over the age of 55. Some of this could be age discrimination. We don't really know. We also hypothesize that it could be care responsibilities such as caring for grandchildren or elders. So there is age discrimination. We know that, just like there's all sorts of other kinds of discrimination. And I think the way we fight that is the way that we fight all forms of discrimination, is really making sure that every time we assign a job, we hire someone, we allocate resources, we're thinking to ourselves, are we doing this in a way that is making sure we have the best representation of people? And I think that it has to be, it's not like one thing that you do, it's many, many things that you do, but you have to always be having that front and center in the decision-making that is there. And I think if this question also relates to maybe return to work, women who've been out of the workforce because they've been taking care of children, returning to work in their middle age or later, there is, potentially a difficulty in getting back into the workforce, either because you haven't been in the workforce to accumulate the skills or because people think that you might not have the skills. So I think that's where, there's been big investments lately in returnships, in educating, back to work programs at the Rotman School of Management. The Institute, the Initiative for Women in Business has a back to work program. Women in Capital Markets has a back to work program. These are very important for getting people back into the workforce. And those programs, I think, are increasing as we have increasing demand for people in various jobs. Okay, another question. What type of negative responses would you anticipate for those who don't feel that an economy recovery plan is tied to gender, and how would you address those? Well, thank you for that question, because I've experienced many of those negative responses. I get my fair share of hate mail, including from some colleagues and for many people in society, including some alumni. We had a letter just the other day from an alum complaining that the Rotman School was paying too much attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our society, and saying that this might have been a question for the 1980s, but it's certainly not a question for today. And what I will say is that it is still obviously a question for today. Fewer than 5% of publicly traded companies in Canada are led by women. Boards of directors are still not gender representative. As the previous question mentioned, there's a lot of the people in the most vulnerable jobs, in the least protected jobs, in the jobs with the fewest benefits are women, especially marginalized women, marginalized by immigrant status or socioeconomic class or race. And so we have, when I mentioned before that, when I graduated in 1986, everyone's like, the world is your oyster. And it turns out that it wasn't, and it still isn't. And now, many years have passed and we are not nearly as far as we thought we would be. 35 years ago, we thought we would have gotten there by now, and we simply have not. And there's this idea that somehow talking about gender issues is somehow some kind of luxury. And when the economy is poor, all we should be really focusing on is, the economy and jobs and innovation and things like that. Well, let me tell you, if you don't focus on intersectional gender-based insights, you will not actually improve the economy. Lots of research has been done to show, for example, that if you want to create jobs, the most important thing you can do is invest in the care economy. And there have been wonderful studies that have compared investing in roads and infrastructure and construction related jobs versus investing in care. And when you invest in care, you create more total jobs, even for men. You create greater benefits economically in terms of tax benefits that go back to the government to fund government activities, as well as growth in the economy. And so people say, oh, this gender thing, this is not really about the economics of recovery. And it fails to, I think, recognize the fact that women are 50% of the population. Gender diverse people are increasingly recognized as an important part of the population. And that if we are not thinking along those terms, we're actually not going to get the same level of prosperity and growth that we could have. And in fact, the old systems have really benefited only a few to the disadvantage of many. And if we actually want the greatest economic growth and we want the greatest number of people to benefit from economic growth, then we have to pay attention to these kinds of issues that I'm talking about. These are not nice to have on the side, something you sprinkle on top of your day job or whatever. These are literally the central and essential aspect of our economy, and especially going into the 21st century, it's really, the care economy is only going to grow in the kind of importance in our society. So I've gotten many negative responses, usually from people who are in the historical positions of privilege, who simply cannot see the rest of the world, the disadvantages the rest of the world face, and can't imagine a world that's even more prosperous if we paid attention to those issues. So it's a battle I fight every day. And every time I get an email like that, or a message like that, or someone tweets something about me, I feel depressed and upset for like 2 seconds. And then I say, I need to transform this anger into action. And that's one of the reasons I founded the Institute for Gender and the Economy 5 years ago. I said, I have to do this as my day job. I have to make sure we have funding for this. I need to support this kind of research. And I need to, as we said, change the conversation, because that kind of question, those negative responses come from an old conversation that makes assumptions that the research would tell you are simply not true. So I thank you so much for that question. And it's a battle I fight every day. And so I guess from that person asking it, maybe it's a battle they fight too. And so maybe we can engage in solidarity and fight it together. Okay, more questions. Do we need quotas and rules rather than voluntary compliance in order to achieve the kind of changes you envisage? Okay. I'm actually a fan of quotas, but I understand why people aren't. Let's take boards of directors as an example. In Europe, they've mainly chosen to go the direction of quotas, and they have achieved, in all the countries with quotas, they've achieved boards of directors, all of which have 40% or more representation of women on their boards. In Canada, we chose something different. We chose something called comply or explain, which simply meant that companies had to state whether they had a target or explain why they didn't, state whether they had a diversity policy or explain why they didn't. I've been studying this very carefully. I've actually been reading all of the statements. We're doing a detailed analysis of this right now as one of the projects, one of my own personal research projects. And what it shows is that you don't get very much forward momentum with voluntary compliance on some of these issues. And in fact, in the period of time that Canada has had Comply or Explain, it's in the Ontario Securities Commission, as well as in other securities commissions around Canada, boards have not increase the representation at the same rate that they have in the US without any regulation. So it doesn't seem like our Comply or Explain system is accelerating anything very much. We still have many boards that have no women on them at all, whereas in the US there are no of the major corporations that have no women on the board. So we are behind in Canada, and I think part of the reason we're behind is because we took this sort of compliance mentality and gave people the chance to just explain things away. And their explanations, some of them are hilarious. One company said, well, we're a member of the 30% Club, which is a group of companies that have joined to advance women on boards. And the 30% Club doesn't believe in quotas, so we haven't set a target. even though it's called the 30% Club. And they make lots of excuses about quality, and we don't want to compromise quality, which I think is ridiculous. Because why I say it's ridiculous, the research on quotas has shown that actually when you put quotas in place, you increase quality. Why? Because it forces you to look harder around for women, people of color, women of color, women, people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ community, and others. You look harder for those people, and you find all these qualified people who have not historically been in the networks that allows them to be considered. And they're not in the networks to be considered, and so they don't get the opportunity, but they're highly qualified. What it also means is some of the more, and there's an academic paper in the top economics journal, American Economic Review, called the Crisis of Mediocre Men, because they studied quotas, and what they basically showed is that once quotas were in place, the people who were displaced because of quotas were the mediocre men, were the men who were not very qualified, but because of historical networks and advantages, were getting included in things like boards of directors. And so I think quotas can, in certain areas, can really make a huge difference. Why? Not because they force you to accept a whole bunch of people who aren't qualified. What they do is force you to look for the qualified people. And it takes effort. You have to invest more, and people feel exhausted and don't feel like they have to have the time. But if you look hard enough, you will find extremely qualified people. And having more diverse groups, whether it's in your innovation team or on the board of directors, is going to lead to better outcomes for your organization. So I am personally a fan, but I also see at a minimum, companies should be setting targets for all sorts of things, because what gets measured gets done. So don't call it a quota, call it a target, and then evaluate yourself against that target. And if the target isn't a big target that actually forces you to look hard and really expand your networks, then I don't think you're doing your job. Okay, more questions. When we talk about women's situation in the workforce and during pandemic and how this situation is affecting them, we mainly talk about women with children, women who have a partner, are married, or take care of elderly parents. We usually see them in the context of family relationships and those responsibilities. How do we see this pandemic affecting women who live alone, are single, and don't have children, besides the mental health impact? Well, first, I think the mental health impact is really important, and I don't want to neglect that. The mental health impact for everyone has been extreme, and for women in particular for this pandemic, and really spiked at the beginning of the pandemic. So, and when you have a mental health crisis or a challenge or anxiety, it's going to affect your ability to do your job. So for everyone, it could be having an impact on their ability to perform well, and therefore to get promoted or to get higher wages or to get better job opportunities. But it also, I think one of the things that we know from research, even prior to the pandemic, is that women, whether they have children or not, suffer the motherhood penalty. That is, when you're young, I don't have children myself, but all of my years when I was of childbearing age, people would constantly ask me, oh, you're going to have kids and that kind of stuff. There are biases built in, even with young women who don't have children. Employers often will think, oh, I don't want to hire that woman because she'll, get pregnant and have a baby and she'll be out and it'll create a whole bunch of pain for me in the organization. And that's why it's so important to get men to take equal amounts of, not 2 or 3 or 5 weeks, but really equal amounts of leave, because that's the only way that we're going to really rectify that penalty that women pay for whether you have children or not, and the anticipation of having children. The other way that this affects young and single women is that because of historical motherhood penalties, there has been this understanding of jobs that are more for women and jobs that are more for men. And so even if we look at tech companies, when you look at their hiring, even across engineers, they'll hire the men to be the coders and the women to be on the user interface. And so they think that's more of a women's job, but that user interface is not the kind of promotable, high go-getter kind of job, the same way that coding is seen as like the most prestigious job in tech. And so, because, we see that young women are impacted by these notions, by the gendering of jobs, related to the fact that that many women have children, not all. So young women are impacted by this in all the way, because childbearing has led to gendered notions about who does what kinds of work and what opportunities there are in our society and who's promotable and who should be a CEO. And so these dynamics that I'm describing really affect women of all ages. And so young women should care about them. Even if they don't have children and don't even plan to have children, they need to have solidarity with those who do, because we're all kind of in this together. Okay. We're getting right down to the end. We only have a few minutes left, but we have one more question. It's quite long. Let me see if I can get into it. Unquestionably, women add diversity, and having women on teams have many positive benefits. Reading Jordan Peterson's thesis on women, Jordan Peterson, I don't even know if I want to go too into detail on commenting about him, but I don't think he's adding a productive conversation in our society. In fact, I think he's really leading to more polarization. We're really in this all together, and the kind of polarization that certain people like that promote is unhelpful. But he says that there's evolutionary biology and women voluntarily leave the workforce. So let me say about voluntarily leaving the workforce. At any one moment, when a woman does choose to leave the workforce, maybe for caregiving responsibilities, it does feel like a choice, and we all want to have agency. But one of the reasons it feels like a choice is because there is this kind of neoliberal kind of project that drives everything down to the individual. The question is, what structures that choice? If, for example, her boss has not been giving her great work opportunities because they think she's going to have a baby, if, for example, she didn't get that promotion and some guy got the promotion instead of her, when it comes time to caring for children, it's going to be so much easier for her to say, look, my job is not fulfilling. I'm going to, quote, choose to go out of the workforce. But the reason she's choosing is because the job is not flexible enough for her to have responsibilities, because society is not evolutionary. Men get the same level of hormones if they actually care for their children. It's just that we don't give men the opportunity to care for children. There's nothing biological other than the actual birthing of a child. And breastfeeding. The rest of it is not biological. And so this is not evolutionary. This is socially constructed. And what I really want to say here is that our society has made it so that it feels like these are choices, when in fact they're not choices. They're choices that have been structured by lack of flexible work, lack of promotion opportunities, the gender wage gap. All these kinds of things are things that are pushing women out of the workforce, not things these are not choices. And so I really want to, our research absolutely does not support anything to do with, the research does not support the evolutionary argument. The research does not support this idea that these are just women's choices. The research actually supports that we have a social structure that disadvantages women, people of color, immigrants, and the others, and that those social structures force people into really difficult choices that they shouldn't have to make if we had a more equitable society. So I know we're very close to the end of time. Thank you for all of those wonderful and challenging questions, and thanks for the opportunity to comment on them. Thank you for joining this event. You'll be getting, I think you already got, and you'll be getting again a reminder of all the different ways that you can connect to the Institute for Gender and the Economy, links to our website, in the follow-up email. If you're interested in our gender analytics training, there's that. So you'll be seeing a lot of different links coming to you, and I encourage you to click on them. And one thing that I will simply say is that I'm so grateful for those of you who have supported our work financially, that the Institute for Gender and the Economy gets no financial resources from the university. Every salary we pay, every bit of research that we support, every activity we do is from money that we have fundraised for. And many of the funds are coming from our important alumni from around the world. And so you really have a role to play in advancing these conversations. And I would welcome the opportunity to talk with you. If you were interested in trying to support our work, we have opportunity to do that on our website as well, because all I spend my time doing is making sure that we have the funds we need to be able to continue this really important work. We're celebrating our 5-year anniversary. We've just been totaling up all of our impact over the last 5 years, and it's been really tremendous, and we want to be able to continue that, and we can't do that without you. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to these ideas. And thank you so much for your support of the work that we do here at the University of Toronto. And I will turn it back over to whoever's in charge and just thank you all for a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Sarah Kaplan, for that fascinating and thought-provoking lecture. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this talk. Please check out the wide range of other programming available to you through the university's hub, and take a moment to let us know where you were tuning in from for today's session and to offer some thoughts on the presentation. Best wishes from all of us at the University of Toronto, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.